So the last presentation of today will explore the situations where geographical indications do not achieve their role of tools of development. So just some preliminary remarks. We will now talk about two main situations. The first is when the GI registration has just no effects. Here we are talking about sleeping GIs. And the second situation is when the geographical indication dynamic has negative effects. So for sleeping GIs, they are observed when the registration brings just almost nothing locally. So there is no appropriation by the local actors. It can be public or private actors. There is no collective action, no collective activities are planned, organized, etc. And there is no visible development process ongoing. And this is a very common situation in ASEAN, but also in Europe. So sleeping GIs exist everywhere, and that's a very, very common situation. Regarding the negative effects, it's important to say that maybe these negative effects will not be perceived in the same way by all the actors. So maybe you will have a perception of a negative impact of the GI for the processors, but maybe not for the farmers. Or maybe you will have a perception of a negative impact for Robusta coffee growers, but not for the Arabica coffee growers. So this question of negative effects must be considered depending on the different actors involved. During this presentation, I will use several case studies. So for some case studies, I did the field research myself, but for others, I just use scientific literature, and I will not enter in the description of the case studies. I will just present them briefly when I need them. And the idea is just to understand the situation and observe the no effect or negative effect situation and keep in mind the warning points. So it will not be a raw description of the case studies. So we will first look at this problem of sleeping GIs, and more precisely, we will explore the mechanisms that create sleeping GIs. And then we will analyze these potential negative effects on economic dimension. Here we will speak about ineffective GIs to have a positive economic impact. Then the negative impact on social dimension, and here we will describe unfair GIs. And then we will have examples of situations where there is a negative impact on the product itself. And here it would be more like irrelevant GIs that are far from the initial concept of and philosophy of GI protection. Sleeping GIs are observed when, as we said in introduction, after the GI registration, the local actors just do not use the GI. So the registration project is done. The registration is officially done, but it remains an administrative action. And most of the producers, the farmers, collectors, processors, sellers, and also most of the buyers and consumers, they don't even know that there is a GI that has been registered. So the question in this situation is how to find an incentive to start collective action after the registration. To investigate this question of collective action, it's for the case of GI, it's very important to analyze the rationale that was behind the GIs at the very beginning of the GI application elaboration. Maybe you remember in the second presentation, we had this slide at the beginning of the presentation for the economic rationale behind GI. And we described two different situations. So in the first context, the green, for the green square, we have the situation of commercial advantages that are pursued by producers. And in this situation, the objective of the GI, the rationale, is to protect an already existing added value. And the justification of the GI is to protect this added value and to fight the usurpation of the name. So here we have a common problem identified by all the actors, and this common problem is the usurpation of the name. So we have a common problem to fight. We have something to federate people because they are all feeling the negative effect of usurpation. So the GI here is registered in order to protect producers from usurpation. So we said it was a defensive strategy. For the second situation in orange, as we said, it's a totally different context. There is no common problem because there is no usurpation. The GI is here to create something new, to create a differentiation for the product on the market, to create progressively reputation and maybe capture a new added value and put the product in a niche market. So this more offensive strategy was qualified as more innovative as regard to the historical justification of GIs. So let's see now how collective action is analyzed in the two different situations. So in the first context, we start with this very famous product, which is facing usurpation. So for example, it is the case of cognac from France. It is also the case of Toraja coffee from Indonesia. And it is also the case of Buon Matwat coffee from Vietnam. So we have this product already famous, which is facing usurpation. And the GI registration has as a rationale to reduce, to provide means to fight usurpations. By reducing usurpation, the GI will raise the interest of producers for the GI and increase also their incomes by protecting the added value. And maybe part of these new incomes will be reinvested for promotion and marketing of the product, which finally will consolidate, reinforce the reputation and the visibility of the product on the market. So here we can see appearing a virtuous cycle. So the GI protect, reinforce the added value and the reputation of the product. It increases producers' income, and part of these incomes are reinjected in the dynamic. So in this first context, we have a high incentive for collective action because it starts with this common problem and this understanding of interdependence of producers, because the reputation of the product is a common resource for them. So they need to cooperate to fight usurpation and preserve the reputation of the name. Collective action is always facilitated with the identification of a common problem. But in the second context, there is no usurpation. So there is no common problem. We start with a local product, but it is not a typical origin-based product yet, as we described them in the introduction. So for example, we have a wine from Pic Saint-Loup, which is in the south of France. I actually come from this area. No problem of usurpation for this product at the beginning of the GI. it was also the case for Kintamani Bali coffee. We will see that more tomorrow morning, but tomorrow afternoon for you in Asia. Kintamani Bali coffee had no problem of usurpation that was regularly reported at the beginning of the GI. It's also the case for Articot from France also. No problem of usurpation. For this product, the reputation of quality is low or average. The quality of the product is heterogeneous sometimes or irregular. And the link to the origin is not very recognized even by the producers themselves. So the objective of the GI process in this case is to progressively do a differentiation of the product on the market. And how? By implementing the specification with specific techniques that are not used by all the farmers already or all the processors already, and also by communicating on this product, on this dynamic of quality, and so on. And doing that needs a lot of collective action and coordination. And these activities are most of the time supervised by public actors like agricultural, extension services, or local government. And why? Because such collective investment is no private actor will do that by themselves. It's too collective to be done by only one private actor. Such collective issues are always supervised by public actors. With time, if the strategy is successful, the differentiation of the product will open new quality markets where the product will have premium prices, and it will enable a raise of producers and processors' income. Part of these incomes can be used for a collective promotion and control, but here again, collective action is needed strongly, because nobody will, as a private company, will make collective promotion. It is a very specific balance between competition and cooperation, and this requires a lot of coordination among actors. And finally, thanks to all these efforts, the reputation of the product is consolidated on the market. And finally, we can see again a virtuous cycle appearing. But in this context, the process requires a high level of innovation for the producers, but also for the processor, for all the actors. The implementation of the specifications, the control, etc. These are very new activities, and it's compared with the context number one, it is even more challenging here, because these actors are not interrelated in any way. They are not used to work together before. So there is here a low incentive for collective action, because there is no common problem at the beginning. And it can be evaluated as a very risky situation for private actors, especially. Maybe they will not want to be the first to play the game. It's always the same. Collective action in this situation can be judged very risky, because there is no guarantee of reciprocity, that if I play the game, will you play the game? It's a very common situation of a tragedy in collective action. So finally, the GI in this situation will maybe not be used or will be underused. So the book of specifications will not be implemented. The use of the name will not be regulated, and there is no collective activities organized. And progressively, the GI will just remain a certificate, but in terms of development, it will bring nothing. So it's just a sleeping GIs waiting to be activated. Here are some of the risk factors that induce situation of sleeping GIs. So first is the lack of information and investment of producers at the beginning of the GI. It's always more difficult to involve actors in collective action when they have not been involved in the beginning to elaborate the rules of the game. So lack of information and investment from the beginning. Second risk factors is the markets where there is no demand for origin-based product, because there is always a price to pay for a certification and so on. And if there is no demand for certification or origin-based product, it can be difficult to see the premium prices arrive. A third risk factors is when there is no GI managing group established, then who will coordinate local collective action? So yeah, it can be a risk factor. And related to this point, sometimes there is a GI managing group, but there is no budget or nothing is done, or sometimes also there is a lack of recognition of legitimacy of this group to coordinate. So it is also a risk factor. There are, of course, challenges at national level to encourage the use of GIs. So, for example, it's important to inform domestic consumers about the GIs and what is this label, what is it guaranteeing, what is it for? And it's also very important to implement a system of control of usurpation. It's difficult, but it's important. And this is a responsibility of national competent authorities. We will now take examples of cases where negative effects are reported. So it can be economic, social, or sometimes negative effect on the product. So in most GI projects, one of the main objectives, it was the first rationale of the second presentation. So one of the main objectives is to increase producers' incomes. Most studies to evaluate, to assess this increasing in income, most studies just focus on selling prices, but these do not really reflect the profitability of the GI. And this profitability also depends on the production costs that are required to implement the book of specifications. The GI dynamic can have positive or negative impacts on the production costs. It depends on the specifications, if they are very restrictive or not. But also we have a probable raise of cost for control, administrative stuff, and certification because of the GI project. So several studies identify a raise in production cost because of the GI. And also the GI projects are most of the time subsidized by public funding, but only for 2 or 3 years. And after the GI registration, then the costs remain for the producers. An in-depth investigation on a Penja paper in Cameroon established, it is surprisingly, that in fact, the profitability for the GI producers after GI implementation is higher than before the GI, or for the producers that do not follow the specifications. But on the contrary, we have several examples where we can see that the profitability is decreasing with the GI. So this is the case of honey from Oku in Cameroon. In this situation, it's a complex context because there is already a very high demand for honey, just as it is produced, so just without any quality sign. And also the specifications of the GI will generate a high increase in production costs. So there is no incitation for the producers to implement the specification. And very, very good study of Pico Duarte coffee in Dominican Republic has the same conclusion. The researchers are questioning the profitability of the GI because the increase in price for coffee farmers is very uncertain, but the increase in cost is very certain and very high because of very restrictive norms included in the specifications. So for honey from Oku in Cameroon and for Pico Duarte coffee in Dominican Republic, the GI is at this stage, at the moment when the studies were conducted, ineffective to increase the producer's income. It's the opposite. But maybe it is just a transitory phenomenon, but such challenging GIs regarding profitability may end up in sleeping GIs because there is a very, very low incentive for producers to invest in the book of specification and implement the specification. Additionally to producers' income, the fair distribution of the premium is very important to assess for the economic impact of GIs. So it depends on the level of information of the farmers and on prices, and also their ability to negotiate prices with their collectors and buyers. So again, here for honey from Oku, we have a comparison of the distribution of premium before and after the GI. And we can see that the farmers used to receive 17% of the prices of added value before the GI, but only 9% after the GI. So for this specific point of the distribution of added value, I would like to make a comment because I tried many times to calculate that. It's very difficult to calculate because you have a lot of factors to take into account to really get consistent data about this repartition of added value. So here for the case of honey from Oku, the authors of the report just mentioned that the data are uncertain. So it's very difficult to have precise data about that. In my opinion, the GI dynamics most of the time reinforce and increase the power of negotiation of farmers. So it's very difficult to assess this aspect, but it can be a negative impact. The next point is about the social negative impacts that GIs may have, and mainly by excluding some producers or some actors of the development process. So these are qualified of unfair GIs. There is a huge literature about this, and it is describing more inclusive or more exclusive approaches in the design of GIs. It is important that this question of inclusion should always be discussed by analyzing the case studies embedded in their local contexts. For every GI, the local actor will delimitate an area and define specification to be implemented So this will de facto exclude some producers. So exclusion is part of the GI process. So this is why some researchers will qualify GIs as good club. Some other researchers will just say that it's not that easy to exclude people from using the name and the reputation. So it would be more common resources than club goods. But anyway, the exclusion process is just part of the GI itself. So it's important to keep that in mind, and for the stakeholders involved in the design of the GI and specifications mainly and GI area, for them to keep in mind this question: what are the criteria of inclusion and exclusion? Who will be excluded and why? And what are the social impacts on the local community? So the objective is not to include everybody. The objective is to make reasonable choices and be aware of the social impacts on the local community. In some very specific cases, the exclusion effect is particularly visible, and sometimes there is even a risk of appropriation of resources by some actors. So this is the case of Meovac honey in Vietnam. So we are in the northern part of Vietnam, in the beautiful district of Meovac. It's a mountainous region. And in this region, there is a seasonal blooming of wild mint and also a local bee called Apis cerana, which produce natural honey, which is traditionally harvested by a Hmong family directly from natural beehives, just directly from the trees. There is a regional reputation for Meovac honey, and mainly for medicinal use. And the price premium is very high. This honey is sold 10 times the price of a standard honey. And more recently, we witnessed the beginning of a touristic market for this product. Since 2000, the local government started a program to increase the production of Meovac honey and protect the local bees, because other bees from the valley were attacking the bees of the plateau. And there's also an objective of the program was to modernize the production. So this program worked for the diffusion of a modern model of honey production, which is based on wooden hives and extractors. So we have an illustration on the pictures of this modern model of honey production. In 2008, a GI project was initiated by the local authority of Meovac. We observed a difficult cooperation between local authorities and Hmong families. The GI was finally registered 5 years after, and the GI specifications do not refer to traditional Hmong practices. What is included in the specifications is only the modern model of honey production. So the Hmong families that we interviewed said that they are not interested to participate in the GI, or some families also say they were feeling excluded from the GI. What is sure is that the natural process of extraction, just directly from the trees, is not allowed in the GI specification. So the Hmong families that are still using these techniques, if they want to use the name Meovac on the market, it will be considered as a usurpation. A last example of the negative impact is when the GI project has a negative effect on the product itself. So the GI will here just turn to be irrelevant regarding to the original philosophy of GIs. For example, it is the case when the GI specifications end up in the standardization of practices. We have examples of that, especially in coffee sector, where some book of specifications are sometimes a copy of good agricultural practices, or we have manuals of that in agricultural extension services. But this is sometimes very different from what typicity is, which is sometimes the opposite of good agricultural practices. So this would be, implementing that would be a negative for the product typicity. Another example is that sometimes by authorizing some variety only and not others, the specifications will induce variety selection and then reduce biodiversity. So that was identified by Thomas, who did in-depth research in the Red River Delta in Vietnam. And according to him, the GI process contributed to reduce the global biodiversity of rices in the Delta. Finally, the GI can also create what is called museums of production. So it starts from an origin-based product, and we end up sometimes in folklore. And actually, it's almost the case sometimes in Ahmed Salt in Bali. For this case, sometimes the GI dynamics will create exhibition in cafe and restaurant, but maybe less focus on real social economic dynamics. The last picture on the left is very symbolic. 15 years ago in Ahmed area, the main issue was the competition for land between salt producers and the beginning or the extension of touristical infrastructure, hotels, and so on. But today, many salt producers are employees of hotels, and they are just producing salt in the middle of bungalows. So yeah, it's a kind of museums of production. So the GIs are not always tools of development, as we define them in the second presentation, and unattended GIs can remain sleeping GIs, or sometimes also they can have negative effects on communities. So it is crucial to anticipate the impact of GI registration and always keep in mind the success factors that make a GI an effective tool for community-based development. And tomorrow will be dedicated to these success factors, as we will explore some recommendation for GI practitioners, and especially at local level. And also we will see experience of EU public policy to support and promote GIs. Thank you very much.